Hello friends! Today I want to show you the process of painting these water lilies. This painting was not an ambitious piece. The main goal was to just distress myself, use lots of watercolor textures and paint something simple. Of course that I overcomplicated the painting in the end, but let's see how it went from the start. This painting was supposed to be green, and the only other color needed was a bit of yellow ochre for the center of the white flower. For this I used Raw Sienna and Raw Sienna Light by Daniel Smith. Green is lately my favorite color, and I own lots of tubes from different brands, different shades, smooth and granulating ones. And in this painting I ended up using almost all of them. I even used one tube from Daniel Smith that I've never used in a painting before, and that's the duochrome metallic paint. Saguaro Green is the name. I'll talk more about different shades later on. Also, I don't want you to think that you need this amount of paints and plenty of shades to create something similar. In fact, I could have easily achieved a nearly identical result with 3 colors or so. In today's process, I'm simply coming from a perspective of someone who's been collecting watercolor tubes for a decade and wants to play with the collection once in a while, take all the paint for a walk, I'd say. There is no way I will ever use all the watercolor paint that I currently own, and it would appear a bit wasteful, but I usually make use of the tubes that I didn't touch for a long time in my live workshops. First, I started by wetting the entire surface of the watercolor paper with clean water. For this, I use a broad hake brush. Then I started to play around with lightest colors on my palette. Some colors that I picked for this composition were also blue. This is what works best for me to achieve really dark greens, is to add blue into them. But this first layer, I just wanted to see what the colors look like and how they granulate. And this is how I like to play around with my first layer more often than not. I use so much water that you'd think that my paper will break, but 300 GSM cotton paper can withstand this even if I do this repeatedly without any troubles at all. Also, Saguaro Green looks like Raw Sienna more than like a green paint, and it only got metallic accents after it dried, so that was interesting. This part of the process is so much fun, and I never know exactly what it will look like after it dries. When I first dampened my paper with clean water, I did not realize that I have a white flower in the middle of all that green wonderfulness, and so I set myself up for extra work even before I started. Once I started to apply the greens, I tried to dry the flower area with a tissue, but some of the paint still bled inside. And here you can maybe even see like slight shimmering of the Saguaro Green paint, and it changes slightly depending on what color you paint it on, but this effect was very interesting and I've never used that in a painting before. In the next layer, I tried to paint more structure of the individual leaves. The leaves, they had a light dot in the middle, and first I tried to do negative painting around the dot, which helped me to give them some more depth, but then I realized that lifting technique might work slightly better. But for now, painting these few shadowy areas into the leaves was like enhancing the first layer a bit, and after that was done, I let everything dry because from that point on I wanted to use a wet on dry approach more. And when you're painting even one layer with such dark paints, it happens quite often that you lose the sketch and you can't see it anymore, which is why I had to sort of grab my mechanical pencil and go over the lines that I could see at that point, but some of them were lost, and so I just had to basically redraw it. And now that the textures are in place and I see the drawing of each leaf clearly, I can move on to paint the darkest background layer, and a mix of Prussian green and Payne's grey was used for this, I believe. This is the layer that already makes the painting look half finished, and you see so much of the full picture once you paint it in place. I love how much contrast this dark background gives to the leaves and allows for green textures to pop even more. By the way, this is what's called negative painting technique. You paint the leaves by painting the background around them, and watercolor painting heavily relies on it when painting lighter objects. The white flower in the middle is the biggest example of this. It would be nearly impossible to show this to the viewer without darkening the areas around it, since watercolor does not have white paint and all the white that we get is from the paper surface. Oh, and sometimes I create gradients using spray bottle, and it helps me to feather out the paint more smoothly without touching the paper with my brush. I wasn't satisfied with the lightness of certain areas, and I did not use any masking fluid to keep these areas light beforehand, and so I tried to solve this with lifting technique. Some papers allow for lifting of already dried pigment, and the Canson Moulin du Roi paper that I'm using is one of them. It really complements the textures too, but if you plan on doing too many layers, I would not recommend it as a best choice. Anyway, back to lifting. To attempt this, you need a sturdier brush than your regular watercolor brush. Synthetic bristles with a pointy tip work best for me. What I do is to just dampen this area and rub it a bit with clean water and then lift the released pigment with a tissue. And once I started doing that, it was very hard to restrain myself. I just wanted to see how far I can go with this and what textures of lightened areas are going to look like. I think it helped me to give depth and form to the leaves, but I also made the center of my painting a little bit chaotic, and later on decided that I need to paint an extra wash of paint to cover this area up again. So you could say this was a wasted effort, but it really isn't. I think it's the best thing you can do as an artist is to try and push your technique towards extremes and then observe what it does and make decisions regarding how much of that you're going to keep. This was a priceless lesson for me. Painting the white flower was the only straightforward part of my process, while I still have to do more studies on painting white objects in watercolor because that gets quite difficult. I tried my best not to end up with shadows that are too dark, and my approach to painting flowers is to work on one area at a time, which means moving across the flower petal by petal. I wet an area first and then I place pigment inside to get seamless gradient. Here I worked with a very transparent mix of Payne's grey with a few of those greens. If you want to learn more about this approach and how to paint a watercolor flower using simple techniques such as wet in wet and wet on dry, I recommend you check out my new Skillshare class where I did my best to explain this approach and even designed exercises to bring you great looking results right from the start. It is suitable for beginners but also intermediate artists that want to polish their technique even further, and you can take it for free using my free trial link down in the description. And in the end of this video, I want to show you a few lovely artworks created by some of you that already took my class. Back to the water lily. After I shaded the white flower, I realized that I have to get white gouache to fix the mistakes from the first layer, and only after repainting some areas with white, the flower looked neat. And if I did the painting all over again, this would definitely be one thing that I would avoid, and that was the dampening the flower silhouette during my first layer. Near the end of my process, I had some cast shadows to paint in, and also the flower bud in the top right corner wasn't painted yet. And this area was so light that the bud didn't stand out at all, and so I decided to paint the leaf behind it slightly darker to make it more visible. The very last part was totally experimental. This had nothing to do with the realism, but the idea was to draw in a decorative texture of some sort to make it feel more like an imaginative illustration, and so I decided to paint in a couple of lines around each leaf shape. I'm still undecided whether this improved the painting or caused harm, and I still feel these things look slightly better on a base that is more flat and uses blocks of color rather than textures like I did. You can tell me your opinion in the comments, I would greatly appreciate. Lastly, dark lines didn't quite do it, and I wanted to see what a white line would look like on the top of some leaves. And if I want to check out what something looks like and don't want to mess up the painting, I sometimes grab color pencils and create light marks just to see the result. These can then be erased, and so if it doesn't work out, it's quite easy to return to the previous stage. And I thought it looked great, so I went ahead and used the white gel pen to finish the illustration. Now, the very last thing of the process were splatters, but used backwards. Usually I do splatters on a white background, let the water with pigment drip off of my brush, and then they dry into these lovely abstractions. This time I used clean water to do a few splatters in a similar fashion, but after a couple of seconds I removed the pigment that was released with water using a tissue. The final effect looks really interesting and fits the painting very well. And here they are, my water lilies. I really want to do this painting again and maybe find a simpler approach and see which one I like best, as long as I can use my favorite greens again. Lastly, I want to do a shout out to all my students over on Skillshare. My very first class on the platform was released about 2 weeks ago, and I can't believe there are already over 240 students watching it. I know that to create a class project takes some time, and it's probably normal that not everyone shares the project with the community right away, but I am a new teacher and I'm very curious to see the proof of people actually improving their technique after taking my class. And this is why I want to support those 3 of you who already posted pictures of your painting. First one is Eva. She created this gorgeous magnolia. I admired the seamless gradients she managed to achieve the most, and sadly I did not discover her Instagram to share with you. Second one is Miwa. She experimented with adding the background, which was interesting to see, but she also managed to paint a second bonus lesson that was quite advanced and did very well. She is also a teacher, I learned, and this is her Instagram page where she shares her art, so shout out to her. Last project is from Radhika. Forgive me if I'm pronouncing the name incorrectly. She painted a first bonus lesson from the class and made lovely pictures of the final paintings, and her Instagram is really lovely and well curated. So thanks again to all of you. Can't wait to see more projects. And this is it for today, but you will hear from me one more time this week, since in 2022 we have 2 new weekly videos on this channel. Until then, have a great day and bye!